Joel Lexchin received his MD from the University of Toronto in 1977. He's a professor at emeritus in the School of Health Policy and Management at York University in Toronto, Canada, where he taught health policy until 2016. In addition, he worked in the emergency department at the University Health Network, also in Toronto, for over 34 years. He has published 2 books since 2016, Private Profits versus Public Policy, the Pharmaceutical Industry and the Canadian State, published by the University of Toronto Press 2016, and Doctors in Denial, Why Big Pharma and the Canadian Medical Profession Are Too Close for Comfort. He is a member of the Foundation Board of Health the Foundation Board of Health Action International and the Board of Canadian Doctors for Medicare. He is a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and is among the top 2% of the world's most highly cited researchers. Welcome to this internship.
Thank you. So hopefully I'll have more success at sharing my screen. Okay. Are people able to see that? Good. All right. So my conflicts of interest have not changed since last week. And here they are. Some of them have already been cited. I got a little bit of money for doing a few things, enough to pay for a reasonable meal. And the slides that I'm going to use in this talk have mostly were mostly done by Adam Gaffney, who is an internist in Boston. I think he works in the intensive care unit at one of the hospitals there. And the slides came out of the project that he and I did, which is going to be the basis for the talk today. So this was published back in 2018 in May in the British Medical Journal. And it was a joint project of Physicians for a National Health Program and Canadian Doctors for Medicare. Adam represented PNHP and I represented CDM. We did the bulk of the writing together. And this goes through how we see a reformed pharmaceutical system which would work to the benefit of patients who need medications rather than the benefit of the large corporations which manufacture and sell them. So what I'm going to do is go through what was going on in the US and in Canada at the time that we wrote this, that was the reason that we wrote it, because of the significantly dysfunctional system for producing, promoting, pricing, access to prescription medicines in both countries. Although I have to say that the US is worse than Canada in that respect. Not that Canada is an example to follow. So here are just some of the headlines that were going around in the United States in the mid-2010s, 2015, 16, 17, when we got the idea to write this proposal. And while we were writing it, cancer price drugs are huge. California is trying to rein in prescription drug prices. There are various proposals to do so. Even Donald Trump wanted to do that, although how sincere he was may be open to question. And here's a little bit more detail. So in the US at the state level, there were proposals about reforming formularies. in Massachusetts, California tried to pass legislation about price transparency. Um, there were proposals to base state prices on what the VA pays, Veterans Administration pays, which are significantly lower than other prices in the US. There were proposals in a number of other states and in DC around drug pricing. California was trying to implement limits on insulin prices. There were stories of people dying across the United States because they couldn't afford their insulin. They were using suboptimal doses or just not dosing themselves properly. At the national level, um, there were what was going on in the US and the FDA, which I'll get to in a minute. Um, Bernie Sanders proposed a piece of legislation, which I'll also cover. Currently, Biden has mandated that there be Medicare negotiations on the prices of some drugs, with those prices to go into effect in a year or two. Here in Canada, Canadian drug prices for brand name products are the second highest in the OECD countries. That's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the 31 industrialized countries in the world. You can guess who number one is in terms of brand name drug prices. In per capita spending, in other words, how much money is spent per person in the country per year on prescription drugs, Canada is number 3. And we have just passed legislation, or just introduced legislation actually, which may lead to a universal first dollar coverage plan for prescription drugs. In other words, every Canadian would be covered without any copays or deductibles for prescription drugs on a national formulary. Although how far that's going to go is as yet unclear. Okay, so a little bit more about what was happening at the state level in the United States. Hang on a second. All right. So the California passed a drug pricing transparency bill in October of, I think, 2008 of 17, required drug companies to justify whenever they raise a drug price by 16% or more over a 2-year period. Insurers had to report on how premiums were spent and clarify spending on drugs. In Massachusetts, there was a Medicaid waiver. So the Republican governor at the time submitted a waiver to CMS, which would permit Medicaid to to be able to negotiate prices with pharmaceutical companies. But it also would have allowed the state to determine if drugs had additional benefits over existing drugs, which may have been beneficial overall, but it also would have created a dual standard between what the FDA said about prescription drugs in terms of their benefits and what Massachusetts said, which could have created problems. There were ballot initiatives to bring Medicaid drug prices in line with prices in the Veterans Administration. Most of those, or all of them, failed. And they failed sometimes because of intense lobbying by the pharmaceutical industry, spending tens of $millions or more in lobbying at the state legislature levels. Scott Gottlieb was the commissioner of the FDA appointed under Donald Trump. Before he was appointed, he had already received millions of dollars from industry. At the FDA, he was trying to implement a drug competition action plan. The impact of that at the time was unclear. It didn't go through, but it's quite likely that it would have resulted in the FDA becoming more compliant with what industry wanted. And just as an aside, where is Scott Gottlieb now? Scott is on the board of directors of Pfizer and is also associated with a gene sequencing company. And in fact, every FDA commissioner since 2000, after they left office, has gone to work in one way or another for the pharmaceutical industry. Bernie Sanders introduced a Medical Innovation Prize Fund Act. So just as a bit of background, currently the way that drugs are the incentive for producing drugs or for developing new drugs in not only the United States, but in Canada and in virtually every other country in the world is through patents. In other words, if you develop a new drug, you get a patent on it. The patent is good for a particular period of time. Usually by the time a drug gets onto the market, it has about 10 to 12 years of patent protection left. And during that period of patent protection, nobody else can produce the same drug. So you're free to sell it at whatever price you're allowed to, or in the United States, at whatever price you want to, because the United States, aside from the VA and a few other small programs, doesn't do anything to try and control drug prices. So that's the current system. A prize fund system would be a different kind of system. It would say to companies, okay, depending on how much additional value your drug offers for whatever disease it's being designed to treat, you will get a certain amount of money per year for a certain number of years. So if your drug brings back people from the dead, you may get $10 billion a year for that drug. If your drug reduces the length of the common cold from 7 days to 2 days, you may get $1 a year for that drug. But the idea here is to incentivize companies to develop new drugs which have the maximum public health benefit, because the more benefit the drugs have, the more money that they'll get. And this was the basis for Bernie Sanders' piece of legislation in the Senate, and he got no co-sponsors. He also was proposing to allow drugs to be imported from Canada and other countries into the US, because all other countries have lower prices than the US. This one got 21 co-sponsors, but in fact, although I generally tend to agree with Bernie Sanders on most things, this was the wrong idea. The US is not going to solve its drug pricing issues by importing cheaper drugs from Canada. First of all, we have 1/9 the population of you do. So if you imported every drug in Canada into the US, you still wouldn't have enough for 8/9 of your population, so you would serve about 40 million people, and you would have about 300 million people who were still having problems with drug prices. But more importantly, the US has to deal with drug prices the same way every other country deals with them, which is by mandating negotiation between the government and the drug companies. That's how everybody else does it. They use different methods, but you can't rely on other countries to solve your problems. Okay, now the problems in the US and in Canada in the drug ecosystem are multiple, and you can see them outlined here. So preclinical development, in other words, what kind of priorities do drug companies set for the drugs that they're going to develop? What's the clinical testing process like? We talked a bit about that last week. What's the approval process like at the FDA or in Canada at Health Canada? What does promoting medications look like in both countries? How good are we at monitoring the safety of drugs once they're on the market? How are they priced? And what is the access like to people who need those medications? So what Adam and I tried to do in our piece in the British Medical Journal was tackle all of these issues, and propose solutions for them. And I'm going to run through all of these areas very quickly. So, preclinical development. Drug companies tend to focus on Me Too drugs. So Me Too drugs are things that are similar to existing products that are selling well. So you look at ACE inhibitors, angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, which are drugs used to treat high blood pressure and cardiac disease. There are on the Canadian market, about 7 or 8 of them, and really none of them is any better than any of the others, except for in very small groups of the population. Why are there 8? Because they sell well. So drug companies have an incentive to focus on what's going to sell the most, make them the most money, not what is the most innovative. And here we're talking about innovation as additional therapeutic value over existing drugs. Drug companies use all sorts of definitions of innovation. First in class, new method of action, new method of manufacturing. But really the only thing that matters to clinicians, like you're going to be, or I was, since I'm retired, and the patients we're going to be serving is, how good is it? Is it better than what's already out there? Drug companies abuse the patents. Patents are running out, so they tweak the drug in one way or another to get an additional extension on the patent. That's why the patent for Humira, which is a drug used for inflammatory bowel diseases and rheumatoid arthritis and various other forms of inflammatory arthritis, that should have had a maximum patent of 20 years. But because of tweaking the drug and filing additional patents, those patents are going to last for 38 years, so almost double the time. There is also public R&D money, research and development money, that goes into developing new drugs up to the point when they're going to enter into clinical trials or even while they're in clinical trials. So your tax dollars, my tax dollars, are paying for the development of these drugs, but then the final development is taken over by the drug companies who get the patents and can then set the prices. And this is what happened for Sovaldi for hepatitis C. Sovaldi in the United States, when it came on the market, was a once-a-week drug for hepatitis C, very effective, sold for $1,000 a pill. So when you were taking it for, I think it was 6 or 9 months, $84,000 in cost. But that pill was mostly developed by public funding. And most importantly, when you're talking about preclinical development, industry are the ones who decide on the priorities, as I said earlier, not the public sector. So what are the solutions? No patents for trivial modifications of drugs, no market exclusivity for certain kinds of drugs, repeal the provisions of Bayh-Dole. Bayh-Dole was a 1980 piece of legislation. Prior to Bayh-Dole, if an invention was developed with public funding, the public retained the ownership of that. So the US, if a drug was developed through NIH funding, the NIH then retained ownership of the patent for that drug and could decide how to commercialize it. After Bayh-Dole, if the drug was developed with public funding, private individuals or private corporations, universities were allowed to retain ownership. So you got all these startup companies developing, which then would sell the patents to large drug companies, or the university would license out the patents for hundreds of millions of dollars to drug companies. And that money then went into forming part of the reason for high drug prices. And finally, what we were proposing is the establishment of what we call drug innovation divisions. These would be divisions within either the NIH or in Canada, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And these drug innovation divisions would directly fund drugs, the development of new drugs, which would then not be subject to patents. Clinical testing, we ran through this quite a bit last week, so I'll just go over this very quickly. So we talked about all the problems with industry-supported trials in terms of retaining the data, unreliably reporting the results, designing the studies to make sure that they showed positive outcomes, using surrogate endpoints, in other words, using endpoints that didn't tell us whether or not people lived better or longer. Industry chooses the investigators, decides on the study designs, and retains ownership of the data. So our solutions were that the FDA or Health Canada should demand and only consider drugs where the outcome was clinical, where the trials, where feasible, used active comparators. In other words, they didn't use placebo. it's pretty easy to show that your product is better than placebo. It's harder to show that your product is better than something else. And that's what drug companies should have to do. So they had to use active comparators, and they also had to use superiority outcomes. In other words, is the drug better than what's already on the market? Not as just as good, because what's the value of that? It should be better in one way or another. So more effective, safer, more convenient to use. And we also proposed that there be clinical trial divisions within the NIH or the CIHR that would fund a large number of clinical trials so that we would avoid the problems that are listed up there at the top of this slide. I'll just stop here for a second. Anybody have any questions about any of this? I'm sure that a lot of this terminology is new to people. So if you do have questions, pipe up.
Can I ask a question about something that was presented a little bit further back, the
Sure.
Massachusetts Medicaid waiver?
Yeah.
So is that the one where it was trying to make, oh, okay, I see. So further down, it's bringing Medicaid drug prices in line with the VA. It was a pitch by some of the other states. My question with like that concept, like bringing Medicaid prices in line with the VA, how does that work if like the states contract with managed care organizations to provide the Medicaid benefits? Like, would that say that the pharmacy benefit manager has to negotiate for certain prices that match the VA?
Now you're getting into the weeds of the US system. So pharmacy benefit managers, you know what they are? They're intermediate between the drug companies and the insurers. Pharmacy benefit managers are evil. They have horns growing out of their head and long pointed tails. Pharmacy benefit managers primarily exist to make money for the companies that own them. And in fact, so I'm not sure exactly how that would have worked in the Massachusetts instance, but pharmacy benefit managers should ideally be eliminated. And I mean, you do not, in countries that have universal drug insurance programs, and that includes every country that covers physician and hospitals on a universal basis. So every country that covers doctors and hospitals also covers drugs, except Canada. And none of them have pharmacy benefit managers. So if the US and Canada were ever to go to a universal system, pharmacy benefit managers would vanish and rot in hell. Okay.
Dr. Lexchin, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So this was something earlier that I think you had a quote, and I think it was actually may have been from Trump, but we heard it also yesterday from a speaker who was from a conservative sort of think tank, I guess. I don't know what they would call themselves. But it was specifically that the U.S. is essentially funding the cheaper prices overseas because we're responsible for the innovation and we're responsible for the R&D. Is there any truth to that? And if so, where is the evidence for that?
Okay, so in fact, there is truth to what they were saying. So, I mean, half of the revenue from selling drugs around the entire world comes from the US. So I believe, although don't quote me for sure, but I think there is about 800 billion to $1 trillion worth of drug sales around the world. And half of that, or just about half of that, comes from the US. So as I said last week, you have 5% of the world population, and you consume or you pay for 50% of the cost of all the drugs sold in the world. And most of the new drugs that come on the market are developed by American-owned companies. Not completely, because there are large companies in Japan and in some parts of Europe. But I think if we look at it, probably about 60% of the new drugs that come on the market annually come out of US-based companies. So all that is true. So, but there are other things that the commentator that you mentioned didn't talk about. So one of them is, what's the value of those new drugs? And as I said last week, only about 1 in 10 to 1 in 7 actually make any substantial difference in the therapies that doctors can offer their patients. The second point is that if you look at the largest drug companies listed on the SEC, so about 15 to 20 of them, over the past 20 years, those drug companies have put more money into stock buybacks and dividend payments than they have into R&D. So they're using their prices not to invest, well, they are investing in R&D, but they're using more of that money to make the executives richer, because the executives are primarily paid through stock options. So the more money that the stock is worth, the more money that the senior executives earn per year. So if the US lowered drug prices and reoriented how it's used its money, so yes, you should be able to make a profit. You should be able, but you should be using that profits to put into new research and development, not into making people wealthier than they already are. So you could lower drug prices, put more money into R&D, develop the same number of new drugs, and everybody would be a lot happier, except for the executives, maybe. So this is an example of some truth, but leaving out other things that are quite relevant.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Okay. So what are the problems in the drug approval system? So one is that the FDA and Health Canada are both partially funded by what are called user fees. So in the US, about 60% of the operational budget that concerns prescription drugs, because don't forget the FDA regulates a whole bunch of other things, but 60% of the cost of regulating prescription drugs comes from money that the industry gives the FDA. And in Canada, it's about 50%. So this creates a conflict of interest between the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry. Who's the FDA going to listen to? Is it going to listen to the taxpayers that are paying 40%, or the industry that's paying 60% of what it costs? And when you look at things, there was a study done, back around 2008, where they looked at drugs. Sorry, I'll back up for a second. As part of the bargain for the FDA getting user fees, it agreed to timelines. So it said, we will process your application to get a new drug on the market. You, meaning the drug companies, will process your application 90% of the time within 300 days. And if we don't do that, the next time the user fees come up for renewal, and they do every 5 years, we may not agree to what you want, you being, in this case, the government or the FDA. So what happened as a result of this bargain? User fees for specific timelines. So people looked at what happened as the timeline was approaching. So within 60 days of that 300 days, the drugs that got approved as the timeline was approaching were 5 times more likely to have safety problems once they were on the market than drugs that were approved before they got to that deadline. What does that say? Well, one of the things it possibly says is that the FDA started to get worried that if they didn't meet that 300-day deadline, that they were going to lose money the next time user fees had to be negotiated. So they sped up the process. They finished off quickly what was remaining to be done. They overlooked safety issues, and that's why this particular group of drugs hit the market and then had 5 times greater likelihood of having a safety issue. Okay. There were also, over in Canada and in the US, a rise in the use of what are called expedited approval processes. So expedited approval processes are things like priority approvals, which instead of being done in 300 days are done in 180 days. So you have to go through all that material much quicker. Expedited approval processes are also things like approving new drugs based on limited data, and then telling the drug companies that you have to do post-market trials in order to validate that limited data, to make sure that that limited data was actually accurate. And there are a number of other types of expedited approvals. In the US right now, 70% of all new drugs that are approved use one or more expedited approval processes. But one of the things we know about expedited approval processes is that the drugs that go through those are again more likely to have safety issues once they go on the market than drugs that go through standard approval processes. You've got, the US has the 21st Century Cures Act, which weakens the amount of evidence that's necessary to get new drugs on the market. And as the standards for approval decline, and I talked a bit about that last week. So declining means fewer pivotal trials, so fewer trials that are the basis for the approval, fewer trials with randomization, fewer trials with blinding. As that happens, and that's not clear 100% why it's happening, but it's probably due to industry pressure on Health Canada and the FDA. As standards decline, we get more safety problems. So what are the solutions? So first of all, get rid of user fees and have Congress in the US or the House or Parliament in Canada fund the FDA and Health Canada for as much money as actually required to do the job properly. Both countries got user fees because both governments in both countries kept piling on more and more responsibilities, but wouldn't actually fund the FDA and Health Canada to be able to deal with those responsibilities. Less use of expedited review pathways. Expedited review pathways are supposed to be used where drugs are going to offer major new benefits, meet unmet medical needs. But in fact, if you analyze the benefits of drugs that go through the expedited approval processes, most of them are still offer little to no new therapeutic value. So limit the use of expedited reviews to drugs that really do show the promise of giving patients a major new benefit. And finally, in the US, the FDA uses advisory committees, and oftentimes those advisory committees have people on them who have significant financial ties with drug companies. So impose strict conflict of interest rules about who can serve on US advisory committees. And I briefly mentioned the problems with user fees. So this is Canadian data. Canada has what's called a health technology assessment body. So this is a body that looks at whether or not drugs offer value for money. And in the mid-2010s, this body started to require drug companies to pay what were called application fees. In other words, you want us to look at your drug and recommend whether or not it should be publicly funded. Well, that's going to cost you money. Again, this creates a conflict of interest. So that conflict of interest didn't seem to affect what it said about drugs for cancer, but it did affect what it said for drugs about all other conditions. So before application fees, this body said about half of the time the drug should be publicly funded, and half of the time it said they shouldn't be. After the application fees, this body said 85% of the time that drugs should be funded, and 15% of the time that they shouldn't be funded. So positive decisions went from 50% or 52% to 85%. And this may be due to the conflict of interest that application fees created. We also talked about expedited approvals. So this again is Canadian data. We in this country call accelerated approval. That's one of the FDA terms. So approval with limited data. We call it a notice of compliance with conditions. Don't worry about what all that means. It just means the drugs get approved with limited data. So what happens when those drugs go on the market and companies have to do those studies? So some of the time they do them, but for 16 out of 85 drugs or 86 drugs, it took them more than 6 years to do those studies. So doctors were prescribing that group of 16 drugs for more than 6 years without knowing for sure whether or not those drugs actually worked. And there are drugs that still haven't fulfilled their conditions, the post-market studies haven't been done. So there are 13 out of 50 that we've been waiting more than 6 years for. They haven't approved, they haven't been done. So again, we're prescribing these drugs without knowing if they're any good. How much longer is it going to take? We don't know. And for 2 out of those 13 drugs, they've been on the market for more than 10 years without those studies ever being done. So this is, again, one of the problems with expedited approvals. Questions? All right, post-marketing surveillance. Drugs go on the market, and what happens to them? Well, one of the problem, we all need to do, post-marketing surveillance needs to be done. Because even with the best of clinical trials, there are problems that are unanticipated that are going to show up with new drugs. So we have to keep an eye on them. But one of the things that industry and others argue is that we can get drugs fast on the market faster because then we can rely on post-market surveillance to find those safety issues. We can enhance what we do in the post-market area to make up for getting drugs on the market quicker. So is that a reasonable approach? Well, it might be, except that post-market surveillance is not done very well in either country. So in Canada, Health Canada spends 3.5 times more on getting drugs on the market than it does on monitoring the safety of drugs once they're on the market. And the same ratio is roughly the same, the ratio is roughly the same in the United States. So the FDA is spending multiple times more getting drugs on the market than it is on monitoring the safety of those drugs once they're on the market. And the other interesting point is that the part of the FDA and the part of Health Canada that that monitors the safety of drugs, when you look at the regulatory map, ranks below the part of the FDA that gets drugs on the market. So the part of the FDA that monitors safety ranks lower than the part of the FDA that gets drugs on the market. And in fact, the safety monitoring part has to go back to the part of the FDA that approved the drugs and say, we think you made a mistake. There are these problems that you didn't pick up on. Now, if you get told that you made a mistake, how are you going to react? You're going to say, right, we were stupid. We should have seen this. We didn't. We'll correct it immediately, or you're going to defend yourself. And some of the time, what happens is that the part of Health Canada or the FDA that approved the drugs doesn't admit to making mistakes and tries to defend what they did. So what we proposed was post-market studies have to be done in a timely manner, not the way that they're done in Canada or the way that they're done in the United States. That the post-market safety divisions in both countries have to be funded properly. They should be funded on a par with the part of the agencies that get drugs on the market. And they should also be at a par in terms of their authority. Promotion. So it's difficult to know for sure, but it's likely that more money is spent, or about as much money is spent on marketing as on R&D. It's hard to get figures on this, so this may not be correct. But when I looked at this in the United States with a colleague of mine, we estimated, this was back in 2008, that $56 billion per year was being spent on promotion. Marketing is often misleading. I don't know if you people watch TV and look at the direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription drugs, But that kind of advertising overemphasizes benefits. If you watch it, the side effects are listed while people are skipping through fields or playing music so that you don't pay attention to the side effects. Price is never mentioned. Doesn't tell you how quickly you're going to benefit from the drugs, what percentage of people actually are going to benefit. And regulatory agencies in both countries are overwhelmed by the amount of material that they have to review. So in the US, there are 70 people in the division of the FDA that monitors drug promotion, and they have to deal with over 100,000 pieces of promotional material every year, and they can't do it. There just aren't enough people. There's not enough time. So what are we recommending? Well, more resources for promotional material, for promotional review. So fund agencies in such a manner that they can actually do the job of making sure that the promotion is accurate, objective, unbiased. Sanctions for inaccurate marketing to match product from sales. This is important. Even in the US, the DOJ, Department of Justice, has fined drug companies for misleading promotion. And they fine them what looks like lots of money. So companies have been forced to pay $2 and $3 billion for misleading promotion. But the problem is that when you look at those drugs that they were misleadingly promoted, they actually made $20 or $30 billion from them. So that $2 or $3 billion is just the price of doing business. It's like you going for lunch somewhere and you park in a no parking zone and you have a great lunch and you really enjoy yourself and you get a parking ticket. And that's just the price of having a good time. Direct-to-consumer advertising, drug companies are allowed to write off the cost of promotion. That shouldn't be allowed for direct-to-consumer advertising. And except where the drugs are essential, they should be excluded from public formularies. So companies want to advertise drugs on TV, that's fine, go ahead and do it, but we won't include them on public formularies unless there's no other alternative. We talked last week about continuing medical education and clinical practice guidelines. The role of industry has to be eliminated in those. And for you people, and once you get into training programs in hospitals, there should be strict requirements for reducing or eliminating contact between house staff or medical students and industry. And in fact, there are a number of studies that have shown that the stricter those requirements are, the more separation there is between medical students or house staff and industry. Once those people get into practice, so this is years down the road, the more reluctant they are to interact with industry, the more skeptical they are of what industry has to say. Drug prices. So here is just a picture of somebody who, from his bald head, is probably on chemotherapy. And just to emphasize the cost of the medications that he's required to take. This is a slide about the cost of drugs for multiple sclerosis. And you can see in the third column from the left, you can see what the prices were of these drugs when they were introduced. In the columns that are outlined in red, you can see what the 2013 prices were and how much they had changed since the drugs had been introduced. So prices had gone up 10, 20, some up over 30% per year since they were introduced. What's the reason for that? The drug companies were already pricing the drugs such that they thought that they were going to recover the price of the R&D. So why were they raising the prices so much? Simple answer, because they could. This is current. So this looks at what are the prices, the average price of a patented drug in the United States compared to the price of the average price of patented drugs in all the other countries, or virtually all the other countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And you can see there that Canada being number 2, your prices are still 3.5 times higher than Canadian prices. So if a drug is selling at $100 a pill in Canada, it's going to sell at almost $360 a pill in the United States. So you pay more for drugs than anybody else. So what are the solutions? One is that governments, the US government, should negotiate directly with the drug companies over prices. This might be in terms of setting maximum prices. It might be in terms of using what's called reference-based pricing. In other words, what's the price in other high-income countries? And the US is going to set its price at the median of what these other countries sell, or maybe even it'll set the price at the highest of what all these other countries sell. You'd still save lots of money. What you're going to be doing is using what's called monopsony buying power. Monopsony buying power means that there's one buyer. And if there's one buyer, then that buyer is in a better position than the seller. Because if the seller refuses to negotiate, the buyer can just walk away. And then the amount of drugs that you're going to be able to sell drops dramatically. Now, the buyer can't always let the seller walk away if the drug is really important, but it still gives the buyer a lot of bargaining power. We also said that if drugs were developed through what we called the public pathway, that they would be produced on a generic basis from day one. In other words, it wouldn't be one company producing the drug, it would be as many companies as wanted to, and those companies could then compete on price. We also proposed what's called compulsory licensing. So if the drug company owns the patent on a drug and refuses to negotiate, the government then says, all right, whether or not you like it, we're going to allow other companies to produce that drug as a generic. So you still own the patent and you'll get royalties from those other companies, but you won't be the only ones to be able to sell that drug. And finally, what we were proposing was that the government could set up public facilities to produce some drugs. This used to be done in a variety of countries. Canada used to have a publicly owned company that produced vaccines. Australia did the same. Gradually, these were privatized, but there's no reason it couldn't go back to producing some drugs publicly. So insulin, for instance, could be produced publicly. There's no secret about how to make insulin. This is a slide that just looks at what's called cost-related non-adherence. So what percentage of the population either can't afford drugs, skips drugs, splits pills because of the cost? And in the US, if you were below the average income for the country, that was 25% of the population did that. So 1 in 4 people who were below average income in the United States were not using medications to their fullest benefit. So access. So right now, neither Canada or the US has universal access to prescription drugs. There's all kinds of cost sharing, so co-payments. So drug costs $100. You have to pay your insurance will pay $75. You have to pay $25. Deductibles. You have insurance, but your insurance doesn't kick in until you've paid $1,000 on prescription drugs, and after that, the insurance starts to cover you. Co-insurance. You want to make sure that you don't have to pay any money. Your current insurance doesn't do that, so you take out a second insurance to cover the money that you're going to be paying. So what are the solutions? One is public formularies of essential medicines, universal drug benefit. In other words, everybody in the country is covered, and no cost sharing, no co-payments or deductibles. That doesn't mean that every drug that's approved by the FDA or Health Canada is going to be covered. But if they're not covered, private insurance can still pay for them. But everything that is deemed an essential drug, in other words, a drug that's necessary to keep you healthy, prevent you from getting sick, or make you allow you to live longer, is going to be put on that formulary. So this is not going to be an easy thing to do. In fact, since we proposed this plan 6 years ago, I would say that nothing has happened. And that's partly because this is a complex system. This slide just shows you how complex it is. And so it's going to require not just political will from the top, it's also going to require a lot of pressure from the bottom, from populations that are pushing for reforms, that are pushing against the drug companies with their lobbying. So, bottom lines, drugs can either be treated as commodities, and that's what's happening more and more, especially in the US, or they can be treated as an essential aspect of public health. The current pharmaceutical ecosystem is set up primarily to benefit the corporations that manufacture and sell drugs. Public health is secondary to private profits. And what we need to do is reverse that order.